You've done something most people do at least once. You've kept something, a letter, a photo, a scrap of paper with someone's handwriting on it, not because it's useful, but because throwing it away would feel like erasing something, not the object itself, something else. Maybe it's a note your grandmother wrote. Maybe it's a postcard from a friend who's no longer in your life. Maybe it's a ticket stub from a night you don't even remember clearly anymore. You don't look at it often. You might not look at it at all, but you keep it. And if someone asked why, you'd probably struggle to explain. It's not practical. It's not decorative. It doesn't do anything. And yet, getting rid of it would feel wrong. Now imagine that impulse, not for one person, but for an entire civilization. Not for a scrap of paper, but for a text. A text that gets copied by hand for centuries. Translated into languages that didn't exist when it was written. Memorized by people who can't read. Protected during wars. Rebuilt after fires. Carried across oceans. Not because it's useful in the ordinary sense, but because letting it disappear would feel like losing something central. Why do some texts survive longer than the empires that produced them? Before we keep going, if this kind of quiet thinking is your thing, you might want to subscribe to Belief Explained Simply. These videos move slowly, sit with questions, and don't rush to conclusions. And if you know someone who enjoys conversations like this, feel free to share it with them. All right, let's keep going. The library at Alexandria burned. The palace archives of Persepolis were destroyed. The records of entire dynasties, administrative documents, royal decrees, historical accounts have vanished completely. We don't know what they said. We don't know what they contained. We don't even know what we lost. And yet the Bhagavad Gita, written sometime between the 5th and 2nd century BCE, still exists. The Torah, compiled over centuries in a region that was repeatedly conquered, still exists. The Bible, assembled from texts written across 1,000 years in 3 different languages by dozens of authors, still exists. The Dhammapada, a collection of the Buddha's sayings, still exists. The Quran, written in 7th century Arabia, still exists. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to Laozi in ancient China, still exists. Not just in archives, not just in museums, in homes, in hands, in memory. People who've never read them still know phrases from them. People who don't believe in them still quote them. People who actively reject them still organize their thinking in response to them. These texts didn't survive because they were locked in vaults. They survived because people kept copying them, kept carrying them, kept teaching them to children, kept arguing about what they meant, kept treating them as if they mattered more than the paper they were written on. Which raises a question. What were they protecting? It's easy to say they believed the texts were sacred, divinely inspired, eternal truth. And many people did believe that. Many still do. But belief doesn't fully explain the behavior, because the texts that survived weren't always the most theologically pure, or the most internally consistent, or the easiest to follow. The Bible contains contradictions, different genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke, different accounts of the resurrection, commands that seem impossible to reconcile, turn the other cheek in one passage, righteous anger in another. Paul's letters address specific first-century church disputes in cities that no longer exist. The book of Revelation describes visions in symbolic language that scholars still can't fully decode. The Old Testament contains laws about animal sacrifice, dietary restrictions, and ritual purity that most Christians haven't followed in centuries. The Vedas contain rituals that haven't been practiced in millennia, references to gods no one worships anymore. Language so archaic that scholars still debate what it means. The Quran contains verses that were revealed in vastly different contexts, some during peace, some during war, some addressing personal disputes in a specific 7th century community. If the goal was simply to preserve divine instruction, you'd expect editing, clarification, streamlining, and yet what survived is messy, layered, repetitive, sometimes confusing, which suggests that what people were preserving wasn't just content, it was something else. Here's one way to think about it. A religious text isn't like a manual, it's more like a language. You don't preserve a language because it's efficient. You preserve it because losing it would mean losing the ability to say certain things, to think certain thoughts, to recognize yourself in a particular way. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, the Septuagint, it wasn't because Hebrew had become obsolete. It was because Jews were living in Greek-speaking communities and needed to carry their identity into a new linguistic world. When Jerome translated the Bible into Latin in the 4th century, the Vulgate, he wasn't replacing the Greek. He was making it accessible to a Latin-speaking world. When the Bible was translated into English, Wycliffe, Tyndale, the King James Version, people died for it, were executed for possessing it. Because control over the text meant control over interpretation, and interpretation meant power. When Christian monks copied manuscripts by hand through the medieval period, they weren't just preserving information, they were preserving continuity. The act of copying was itself a ritual, a way of saying, this matters. This connects us to the past. This will connect us to the future. Some monks spent their entire lives copying a single gospel, letter by letter, word by word, not because they didn't know what it said, but because the act of transmission was sacred. The content mattered, but so did the act. And here's what's worth noticing. The texts that survived weren't just the ones people believed. They were the ones people used. Used in prayer, in teaching, in marriage ceremonies and funerals, in disputes and reconciliations, in moments of fear and moments of celebration. They became embedded in the rhythm of life, not as abstract doctrine, as repeated behavior. There's a psychological concept called semantic satiation. It's when you repeat a word so many times that it stops sounding like a word and becomes just noise. But religious texts seem to work in reverse. The more they're repeated, the more weight they accumulate. A phrase you've heard 1,000 times. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others. The Lord is my shepherd. Blessed are the meek. Doesn't lose meaning through repetition. It deepens. Not because the words change, but because your life changes around them. You hear love your neighbor as a child, and it's a rule. You hear it as an adult who's been hurt by a neighbor, and it's a challenge. You hear it after you've failed to love someone, and it's a mirror. You hear, consider the lilies of the field when you're anxious about money, and it lands differently than when you're comfortable. You hear, blessed are those who mourn at a funeral, and it's not abstract theology anymore. The text doesn't move, you do. And because the text stays still, it becomes a reference point, a way to measure change, a way to recognize that you're not the same person you were. That's not doctrine, that's navigation. And it suggests that religious texts weren't preserved because they answered questions. They were preserved because they held questions open. Empires need certainty. They need borders, laws, hierarchies. They need to know who's in charge, who owns what, who's allowed to do what. Empires need conclusions, but religious texts resist conclusion. The Gospel of John begins with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's not an explanation, it's a paradox. Jesus teaches in parables. Stories that don't have single interpretations. Stories that end with questions more often than answers. Who is my neighbor becomes the parable of the Good Samaritan, which doesn't answer the question so much as complicate it. The Sermon on the Mount doesn't provide a legal code. It provides impossible standards. Turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, love your enemies, that have generated 2,000 years of debate about what they actually require. The Tao Te Ching opens with, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The Upanishads ask, who really knows? Who can say for certain? These aren't instruction manuals, they're invitations into mystery, and mystery doesn't collapse. It doesn't get solved and filed away. It keeps pulling people back, which means the text becomes a gathering point. Not because everyone agrees on what it means, but because everyone agrees it means something. Christians have been arguing about the Bible since the beginning. The early church debated which texts even belonged in it. The Council of Nicaea, the Council of Trent, arguments about the canon that lasted centuries, then arguments about interpretation. Catholics emphasized tradition and church authority. Protestants emphasized Scripture alone. Orthodox Christians emphasized mystery and liturgy. Liberation theologians read the Exodus narrative as a call for social justice. Prosperity gospel preachers read the same Bible and see promises of material blessing. Abolitionists and slaveholders both quoted Scripture. Civil rights leaders and segregationists both claimed biblical authority, and the text survived all of it. Because the disagreement was itself a form of preservation. Every argument was proof that the text still mattered. Every interpretation was an act of care. You don't argue about things you've abandoned. Here's something that happens in communities that lose their religious texts. They don't just lose information. They lose the ability to disagree productively. Because without a shared reference point, something everyone has access to, something no one fully controls, every dispute becomes a power struggle. There's no neutral ground, no text to return to and say, what does this actually say? What did we agree this meant? The text becomes the thing you can argue about instead of arguing about each other. It's a mediator that doesn't take sides, and when it's gone, the arguments get personal fast. This isn't speculation, it's pattern. During the Reformation, both sides were arguing about the Bible, not whether it mattered, but what it meant. The conflict was fierce, sometimes violent, but the shared text meant there was always something to return to. A common reference, even in profound disagreement. When the Bible was withheld from common people, kept in Latin, restricted to clergy, the conflict became about access, not just interpretation. The moment people could read it themselves, everything shifted, not because they all agreed, but because they all had standing. Societies that preserve texts tend to preserve pluralism, not because the texts are tolerant, but because they're complex enough to support multiple interpretations. Societies that lose text tend to fracture, not immediately, but eventually, because there's nothing left to argue about except who has power. The text was never the answer. It was the shared question, and that's what people were protecting. Empires collapse for a lot of reasons: invasion, economic failure, internal decay, environmental change. But one reason shows up repeatedly. They stop being able to renew themselves. They calcify. They become rigid. They confuse the structure with the purpose. Religious texts don't have that problem. Because they're interpreted, every generation reads them differently. Not because the words change, but because the context does. Medieval Christians read the Bible through the lens of feudalism, saints and kings, divine hierarchy. Reformation Christians read it through the lens of individual conscience, direct access to God. Personal salvation. Enlightenment Christians read it through the lens of reason and natural law. Liberation theologians read it through the lens of oppression and freedom. Feminist theologians read it looking for voices that had been silenced. Each reading is different. Each one claims to be faithful. And the text survives all of them, because it's flexible enough to be reapplied without being rewritten. That's not about truth. That's about adaptability, and adaptability is how things survive. There's a moment that happens in the life of many religious texts, a moment when they could have disappeared. For the Torah, it was the Babylonian exile. The temple was destroyed, the priesthood scattered, the entire social structure that supported the religion was gone. And yet, the text survived, because people carried it, memorized it, taught it in homes instead of temples. For the Christian scriptures, it was the Roman persecution. Before Christianity was legal, before it was organized, when followers were scattered and underground, the texts were copied in secret, passed hand to hand, read in homes, in hidden gatherings. Many early Christians couldn't read, so they memorized entire gospels, entire letters, not as academic exercise, as survival. Later, during the fall of Rome, when cities burned and libraries were destroyed, it was monks in remote monasteries who kept copying, not because they were ordered to, because they believed it mattered. For the Quran, it was the early Islamic period when the Prophet's companions were dying, and there was a real risk that the revelations, initially oral, would be lost. So they wrote them down, compiled them, standardized them. Not because they stopped trusting memory, but because memory was dying. For Buddhist texts, it was the transition from oral tradition to written form, centuries after the Buddha's death. The decision to write wasn't neutral. It changed the nature of the teaching, but it also preserved it. And what's worth noticing is, in each case, preservation required transformation. The text had to become something different in order to stay the same. It had to move from temple to home, from speech to writing, from one language to another, from one cultural context to another. The Bible moved from Hebrew to Greek to Latin to vernacular languages. Each translation was controversial. Each one was accused of betraying the original. And yet, Each one allowed the text to survive in a new world. The texts that refused to adapt disappeared. The ones that survived were the ones that could be carried, not just physically, but conceptually, into new worlds. So here's the strange thing. The Roman Empire that crucified Jesus is gone. The medieval Christendom that built cathedrals is gone. The colonial powers that spread Christianity by force are collapsing. The empires that produced these texts are gone. The languages they were written in are mostly dead or transformed beyond recognition. The social structures they described no longer exist. The rituals they prescribed are often impossible to perform. And yet the texts remain, not as artifacts, as living documents. People still read the Bible, still argue about it, still organize their lives or their resistance to organizing their lives around it. In some places it's read as literal history, in others as metaphor. In some communities it's the foundation of law. In others, it's poetry. Some people memorize it. Some people have never opened it, but still live in societies shaped by its language, its assumptions, its moral framework. Turn the other cheek. Go the extra mile. The truth will set you free. Judge not, love your enemies. Even people who've rejected Christianity know these phrases. They're embedded in the culture, in the way people think about forgiveness, justice, sacrifice, redemption, which suggests that what was being preserved wasn't the empire. It was something the empire couldn't control. A way of thinking, a set of questions, a structure for meaning that didn't depend on political power. Empires need loyalty. Texts need interpretation. And interpretation is a kind of freedom, not freedom from the text, but freedom within it. The ability to say, this is what it meant to them. This is what it means to me. And that ability to read the same words and see something new might be the thing that doesn't collapse. You probably still have that letter, that photo, that scrap of paper. You might not remember why you kept it, but you know what it would feel like to throw it away. Not like losing an object, like losing a thread, a connection to a version of yourself that doesn't exist anymore, but still matters. Religious texts work the same way, not for individuals, for civilizations. They're the thread that connects a community to its past selves, to the questions it used to ask, the fears it used to hold, the hopes it used to carry. And maybe that's what survival is, not the preservation of answers, but the preservation of the capacity to ask.